everybody, and welcome to this parent workshop about self-directed gender. I am happy to see you all. I'm pleased to present our presenter, Sam King. I pass it over to you.
Thank you, Tess. Thank you so much for inviting me, and it's great to see you all. As mentioned, my name is Sam King. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I work at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. So specifically at our institution, we have a gender program where we work with transgender, gender expansive, gender non-binary, gender fabulous youth and their families. And my role is really in education. So I do a lot of work alongside parents and guardians just to help them understand their child's gender journey and where gender is kind of evolving or folding. And then I'm out in the community a lot. So doing a lot of education in K through 12th grade school systems, but really anywhere that mainly adults are wanting to learn more about gender, just thinking about ways that we can make spaces accessible and affirming around all aspects of gender. So I put together a PowerPoint slide just to allow some structure to my rambling, but I do really love discussion. I find that the best learning happens when we can actually talk about this topic. So as Tess mentioned, please feel free to put any questions that come up for you in the chat. I'll have a couple of spots where we get to just dialogue, but then really at the end, I would love to leave it open to any questions, thoughts, points of clarity that I can offer. To get us started in terms of leaning into conversations about gender, what I like to do is just start us off with understanding the language that we use. I find that when we oftentimes start talking about gender or wanting to lean into gender topics and conversations, there are actually a lot of terms that get brought up that are used interchangeably, and it can make the conversation a little hard to follow and oftentimes can make it confusing. So I want to highlight a few of those terms just so we're all working from the same foundation of language understanding before we jump into the main aspects of gender affirmation and gender support. So the first term I want to define is sex. When we're talking about sex, we're really just talking about biology. So what are the biological differences between us? Oftentimes, our sex gets assigned to us at birth based on our physical, external, genital anatomy. So we're really relying on those anatomical features to indicate someone's sex. But because we're talking about biology, we also want to take into account everything that's happening internally that also contributes to our sex. So also taking into account our chromosomes, our hormones, and our internal organs. All these things that we can't see with our eyes, yet also play a large part in our biology. And so again, when I'm talking about sex, I'm really just wanting to focus on those biological components. Gender also gets assigned to us at birth, often on the assumption of our sex. And this is why people oftentimes use sex and gender interchangeably, because they think that the two go hand in hand. But really, when we're talking about gender and we're starting to lean into how do we define and what are we expecting based on gender, we're actually looking at the social construction behind how we even come to understand gender. So what this often means is when we think about defining gender and we think about what does gender mean, oftentimes these definitions have a lot of different roles and expectations attached to them that are, again, largely influenced by our society. So we oftentimes might think when we pose those questions, what does it mean to be a boy, to be a girl, to feel like neither, to feel like both, or maybe something else entirely, right? How are we defining that? And the reason we look at the social construction behind our understandings of gender is because we can see how these roles and expectations will shift and change across generations. So looking at different generational expectations or different ways that we've attached meaning behind gender oftentimes changes based on what time period we're in. And also looking at the differences between cultures, right? So thinking about our own cultural background, our values, and the messages that we hear from our culture. There's lots of differences on how cultures define those expectations related to gender. So again, when I'm talking about sex, I'm only talking about biology. When I'm talking about gender, I'm looking at this really large social and cultural influence for how we understand gender to be. What I find to be really helpful and where I actually want us to narrow in on the conversation is moving ourselves away from this, again, really large conversation around gender and focus in on someone's gender identity. So gender identity is all about how an individual sees themselves as a gendered being. Every single one of us has a gender identity. Every single one of us can share our own experiences, thoughts, feelings, connections, or disconnections with gender. And that gender identity, might match what we've been told growing up, right? If we're born and the doctor says you're a girl, and then all our lives we hear you're a girl, you're a girl, you're a girl, well, that might feel comfortable for us, right? That might feel comfortable for my own sense of self. Yeah, that fits for me. That feels comfortable for me. And for some of us, it might not, right? Hearing that just doesn't fit for my own experience. My own sense of self is just not connecting with that label girl. And so gender identity, again, is all about that individual experience with understanding gender. Oops. I added sexual orientation to this conversation because just like people use sex and gender interchangeably, I often find that when we start to talk about gender identity, a lot of questions about sexuality come up. And so it's really helpful to understand those differences as well. So sexual orientation is specifically focused on how someone might describe or define themselves based on the attraction that they have to others, right? Who am I attracted to? Who might I want to be in a relationship with? Who gives me butterflies, right? Those crushes that we have. And when we think about attraction related to orientation, we also want to acknowledge all of the different ways we can experience attraction, right? It's not just physical attraction. That could be a component. We also recognize that people can experience emotional, romantic, and or spiritual attraction to another person or other people, right? Lots of different ways that we experience attraction, and it can be one, it can be all of them, it can be none of them, right? But our orientation is also up to that individual to define and describe, what does this mean for me? But really understanding that gender identity is, who am I? In my head and my heart, how do I know myself in terms of gender? Which is very different, very separate from my orientation. Who am I attracted to, right? That connection with another person or other people, multiple people. So one of the ways that I like to visualize this, because there's a lot that goes into this. Again, we as a society try to lump all of these things together, package them up in a nice, neat bow. And that's really where a lot of the confusion comes from when we start to talk about gender. So I myself am a visual learner. I like to visualize what it is that we're talking about. So I want to offer this visual graphic. Some of you might be familiar with this. It might be the first time you're seeing it. There are lots of really helpful visual models out there that talk about sex and gender and orientation. The gender unicorn is the one that we favor at our program at CHOP for a couple different reasons. First, this graphic is very kid-friendly, and it's also highly accessible. So you can print this in 15 different languages. You can interact with it online. You can print it as a coloring sheet to make it more hands-on. There's also an educator guide that's attached to it to help give information about each of these components, right? So if we're having a conversation, if we're wanting to sit down as a family and talk about these topics, and if it's the first time I'm using this, it could be helpful to have a little bit of guide. Here are some great questions to ask when thinking about identity. Here's how that's different than expression. I also really love this graphic because it's actually a tool that was created by transgender youth. So the Trans Student Educational Resources is a really amazing organization that's completely run by transgender youth. And this is just one of many different educational graphics they've created, really to just help people engage in the conversation. So I also just like to think of where are we pulling our information, and being really mindful of where we're collecting resources. I want to just highlight a few things within this graphic, just again, so we can help visualize and understand the differences between these components. So I actually want us to start in this middle section where it says sex assigned at birth. We say sex assigned at birth because once we are born, that is when we are provided a birth certificate that indicates what our sex is. And we can see visually, we have a DNA strand because we're talking about biology. But on unicorn, it's placed in the genital region because we're oftentimes relying on that visualization at birth to indicate how someone will be assigned. And you can see three options listed here. We have female, we have male, and we have intersex. It's incredibly important that we add that third option because we have to acknowledge the diversity that occurs biologically within us as humans, but also just in every species, right? In the animal kingdom, there's lots of biological diversity, and even in the plant kingdom too. When we think about intersex variations, we're actually thinking about a lot of different variations. So when we think about visualization of anatomy, people are absolutely born with ambiguous genitalia. Oftentimes, intersex variations occur internally. Again, think about those other biological components that contribute to our sex. We know that not everyone is born with either XX or XY chromosomes. We can see lots of variation in hormone levels and hormone fluctuations. And we can also have someone who has internal organs that don't align with what we would expect based on external genitalia. So lots and lots of biological diversity, and really highlighting that is important because we want to acknowledge that even biologically, we just don't fit into two distinct categories, right? That binary of two options just isn't all inclusive of all of the diversity that exists. Moving under that, we look at this attraction piece. So we have physical attraction and we have emotional attraction. Again, we separate the two because they do not have to go hand in hand in order for someone to experience attraction. Now, for some of us, the gender we're physically attracted to is the same gender that we're emotionally attracted to. But that's not the case for everyone. And we want to acknowledge that someone doesn't have to experience physical attraction. We often hear from folks in the asexual community who share, I don't experience physical attraction. But that doesn't mean I'm not in relationships. It doesn't mean I don't have emotional attraction or romantic attraction or spiritual attraction to other people, right? I can still engage in a relationship, a meaningful relationship, without that physical attraction being there, right? So just allowing for that expansion of how people can define and describe what attraction means to them. Moving us to the top of this graphic, though, really want us to focus on this piece around gender identity and gender expression. So looking at this graphic visually, we have gender identity listed here and shown here as the thought bubble, really to represent that internal process that we all go through, again, to think about and reflect on our own experience with gender. It's also a thought bubble because gender identity is not something I can see just by looking at someone. Gender identity is something that needs to be communicated or shared in order for me to know how someone feels about their gender. Gender identity has to be shared in order for me to know what it's like for that individual. What I can see is someone's gender expression. So highlighted here by the entire unicorn, how does someone present? And we typically look at expression through different forms, right? So we think about expression through hairstyle, through clothing, jewelry, makeup, even mannerisms, right? How someone carries themselves. All of these things get tied up into our societal definitions and all about how society is defining what is feminine, what is masculine, what is androgynous, creative or fluid. And so I also want to acknowledge that when I look at another person, I am viewing their expression through my lens. So when I oftentimes am talking about gender with my mom, for example, and we talk about what is feminine, we have some similarities and we have a lot of differences, right? What I consider to be feminine forms of expression, my mom doesn't view as feminine forms of expression, right? So I want to be really mindful of when I look at another person, I'm assigning my own definition to them. So really giving that opportunity for a person to also share, this is what expression means for me. I think about this a lot when I see and I hear youth talking about painting their nails, right? I have some youth who are like, yeah, I paint my nails. And to me, that is a way for me to express a more feminine side of myself. And I have other youth who are like, no, this is more creative. It's fun, right? I don't actually attach it to anything gendered. Painting my nails for me is just a creative form of expression. It's not attached to any form of femininity or masculinity, right? So also giving space for the individual to define, this is how expression means, or this is what expression means for me. And ultimately making sure that we're really understanding the differences between identity. How do I feel about my own sense of self versus how might I want to express myself? The two do not have to overlap, right? So we think about someone who might share internally, identity-wise, I'm a girl, right? That's how I know myself. But expression-wise, I would describe my expression as more masculine or more androgynous, right? That expression doesn't change who I am. Just because I like things that might be defined as more masculine or androgynous doesn't change the fact that inside I am still a girl, right? Same thing for someone who's like, yeah, I know myself. I am a boy and I like to wear skirts. I like to wear dresses. I like makeup. And society might label that as feminine, but that doesn't change the fact that I know I'm a boy, right? So really being able to take that time to differentiate out between identity and expression. We'll talk about that in the next few slides. We're going to look at development and how youth are starting to communicate and talk about identity versus expression, but really just taking that moment of pause to remind ourselves that identity and expression do not go hand in hand. This is why I cannot look at someone and know how they identify. I want to do just a quick group activity so we can, if people feel more comfortable utilizing the chat box, feel free to pull that up, or if you would like to unmute yourself, I love hearing other voices as well. I want us to just start thinking about those rules behind gender. Again, going back to that initial slide of that social construction, how do we understand what gender is? And so I want us to take an opportunity to share and discuss different messages we might have heard or seen or experienced about gender growing up. And let's just think within our family system. So sometimes I have folks share, the chores in our household would be designated based on gender. So that was a gender message I got, right? That the girls were inside doing the housework and the boys were outside mowing the lawn or taking care of the outdoor chores, right? That could have been a gender message. So what were some messages or what were some things that, again, you either saw or heard within your family growing up? And again, chat or unmute is totally fine.
I think taking care of siblings or like cousins and other people, like babysitting, was always assigned to female.
Great example. Thank you.
Definite lines in the household that I grew up in around sort of like what you wore and how you expressed yourself, and that, you know, it was made very clear what was acceptable and not.
Yeah, so those expectations around presentation and clothing and expression can definitely have strong gendered connection or messages.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about in my house, there was a huge emphasis on like how to, like, for example, like sit like a lady, eat like a lady, and posture, and like how to carry yourself. And there was always an expectation of not taking up too much space, or a certain idea of like politeness that was absolutely assigned to gender.
Yeah. Can I ask if you remember around what age you first started hearing that?
I mean, I can remember it like all through my childhood into my teens, and it applied to all kinds of things about like from very young, being like something being pointed out to me as like, that's not ladylike, and certain clothing as I got older, like being like not for ladies, and things like that. So that was pretty consistent. I remember. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. And the reason I ask about the age is because oftentimes I will hear that example of either sit like a lady, or statements like boys don't cry, or toughen up, like act like a man. And oftentimes people will share back, like they remember, if they look back, they started hearing that at actually a really young age, and oftentimes not even knowing fully what that meant. And so when we first start hearing some of these messages, can even be, before we can even really kind of have questions or conversation around what does it mean to act like a lady, or what's the expectation to toughen up or act like a man. So thank you for sharing.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Oh no, it's just so funny when you said like I remember being just so confused by the whole close your legs thing when I was a kid. Like I didn't understand why that was different. And then I was like, well, isn't my underwear the same as a bathing suit? Like I was so confused.
Yep.
And no real, not really.
Right? Yeah. Questions. Yep. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, definitely.
Just adding to the close your legs thing, this isn't my story, but I observed a preschool class, maybe 2 and 3 year olds were all sitting outside their gendered bathrooms waiting to go in. And there was a little girl, maybe 2 years old, just flopping her legs around. And the teacher walked by and said, close your legs, you're a girl. Just like said it exactly. And it was so quick and obvious and unnecessary. And I was quite sad for that. But what I'm thinking about from my own childhood was, I don't remember any specific messages about how to behave, but there was just an assumption of staticness that and not much exploration. So I hated wearing dresses when I was younger. And the process of getting the dress for my 8th grade graduation was torturous for everyone involved. And there was never any idea of I could wear something else, and it has continued up until adulthood. Only now am I able to realize I can wear what I want. But back then it was just like, well, this is what you do. And I know you hate it, I hate it, we all hate it, but we have to do it. So there was not a whole lot of exploration.
Yeah.
I was raised with a more of a traditional rule sense of masculinity. By the time I was 8, my dad taught me how to shoot a gun. I expected to be able to fight, even I had no desire to the point where they forced me to work out in 7th grade until I found every possible excuse not to. But that was just an expectation, Of course, I'm a boy. I have to be able to defend myself against who knows what.
Yeah.
But it was the expectation that whatever confrontation or conflict I'm in, I have to be able to resolve it physically because there's no other option. Why would I talk it through? You know, it's just that, yeah, there's like you said, it was static. There's no other assumption that there could be another way.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing. Definitely. Any other examples folks want to share?
I grew up in a pretty conservative country in Greece, in Europe, in the 80s, and in a pretty conservative religious family. And I remember churches would sometimes have gifts at Christmas for all the kids, and there would be the ones for the boys that were wrapped in a certain color, I think, and they were trucks or robots or something like that, and the ones for the girls that were wrapped in a different color that were dolls, of course, something to that effect. And I feel like, yeah, all that, and in advertising, that's very strong with, you know, what the ad shows little, you know, very feminine girls or very masculine little boys playing with and doing, and etc. It's funny because you mentioned jobs in my house, despite my parents being, they were and they are still pretty conservative and religious. My mother, there's another thing, but she insisted that both my sisters and I learn to wash the dishes and get up and, you know, clean the table and sweep the floor, you know. So there wasn't a gender distinction with that, too much to my parents' credit, about who does what job and who's involved in the housework and you know, taking out trash, things like that.
Thank you for sharing. And you bring up a couple good intersections, which leads into this next conversation. So from the example, you know, thinking about that intersection of potentially growing up in a religious community, you know, how is gender being communicated or shared in that? And then also just thinking about in our larger societal context in terms of advertising. So, you know, we have these examples from our family system, and we're starting to hear messages about gender in other places. So where else do we start to learn, or do we start to hear about those rules or expectations related to gender? And again, chat or unmute is totally fine.
I just felt like school sports teams, you just didn't, like, our young people had no options. Like, they would have to make a choice We have our educational institutions, and then even within that, our athletics and our sports. How are we designating those gender expectations? Or, you know, I always think of the example, we have cheerleaders and then we have male cheerleaders, right? So even in athletics, we have this differentiation of how gender will be performed in those roles.
I'm thinking about the social hierarchies enforced in dating, where it's assumed that everyone is heterosexual and that everybody wants to date and everybody can. And if it's not working, then it's because you're not following your assigned gender's rules. And so there's this just constant, like, messages of success and failure tied to your performativity around all of this.
Absolutely, thank you. Someone put in the chat, advertising and TV shows, so kind of thinking about our media, how are things being presented? Any other places? I mean, I think honestly, if we wanted to say everywhere, that would be a fair kind of blanket statement, right? We're really thinking about all of these messages coming from so many different points of entry, right? We have our family, we have our religious or spiritual community, we have school, athletics, relationship roles, think about jobs, advertising, TV shows, movies, books, just the larger media, all of these different places. And so I want to highlight just a quick video clip of a young one who's navigating some of these messages, just so we can get an idea of, you know, how this starts and how our young ones are comprehending what gender means and what does this look like. So let's hear what Riley has to say about gender messages.
Would it be fair for all the girls to buy princesses and all the boys to buy superheroes?
Well, why?
Because the girls want superheroes and the boys want superheroes, and the girls want pink stuff and the boys don't want pink does.
They do.
Yeah,
Boys want both, but why do you think they do that?
because the companies who make these try to trick the girls into buying the pink stuff instead of stuff that boys want to buy, right?
Right, but you can buy either, right? And boys can buy either. If boys want to buy pink, they can buy pink, right?
Yeah, so then why do all the girls have to buy princesses? Some girls like superheroes, some girls like princesses.
Yeah,
Some boy like superheroes, some boy like princesses.
absolutely.
So
You're absolutely right.
why does all the girls have to buy pink stuff and all the boys have to buy different color stuff?
It's a good question, Riley.
It is a good question. And the reason I like showing this video is for two different reasons. So first off, we can see that Riley is young. Riley is young, and Riley is having this experience in a toy store where they're noticing how things are being differentiated, right? You have the girl aisle, which has primarily one color. Then you have the boy aisle that has all the other colors, right? And even though Riley is young, Riley's intuitive enough to know that it's the companies who are tricking us, right? This is all about the companies telling us what we should buy. So our young ones can see gender. They're absorbing these messages and they're figuring out, what does this mean? And oftentimes they're getting it quicker than we as adults may get it, right? The other reason I love showing this video is it shows how straightforward and open gender conversations are and can be with younger kiddos. Because initially, Riley does say that boys don't like pink. And just here's that correction back of, well, boys can like both, right? Lots of options. Boys can essentially like any color that they want. Girls can like any color that they want. And how quickly Riley says, oh yeah, and even corrects themselves at the end to say, boys like princesses. Boys can like princesses too, right? There is that option. And so when we think about starting to have gender inclusive conversations, when we start to open up this conversation, especially to build that foundation with our younger kiddos, it's really about trying to help our young ones understand that you can like anything you like. It doesn't matter what color it is. It doesn't matter what type of clothing or toy or what have you it is. If you like it, you should be able to like it. You know, gender shouldn't actually be a factor in this process of figuring out what you feel most comfortable with. And so those examples you shared and, you know, Riley's experience really just helps us highlight that gender is all around us. Gender is one of those things that's impossible to avoid. My kind of running joke is maybe you could avoid gender if you locked yourself in a padded room with nothing in there, but I still think there would be gender expectations around what we should do in that room, right? How are we asked to navigate these spaces? How are we ourselves figuring out how to navigate these spaces? And oftentimes the messages that we start to hear, we start to see about gender happen at a really young age, often before we can even start to use language to communicate or question what it is that we're seeing or that we're hearing. Now, these messages might embody stereotypes, and they could also challenge them. Right, so thinking about those examples of what are we hearing and then what's the guiding narrative behind that? Does it reinforce that expectation, or does someone maybe say, hey, that rule doesn't always apply and it doesn't have to apply? But really wanting to look at when we think about those gender messages, when we think about how we are navigating this conversation, really want to look at those social and cultural norms. What's the dominant narrative that's existing and creating how we should be understanding gender? As we move into supporting our youth, right, we think about these conversations that our children might be bringing up, or when we're in situations where we're having conversations with youth, how are they talking about gender? How are they understanding gender for themselves? When we think about gender emergence, a main point that I want to make before we start thinking about these developmental stages is that gender emerges across the lifespan. There is not one specific time or age or place or way that someone shares information about this is who I am that is more valid than another. People are going to become aware of their own identity at different times in their life for many different reasons, right? And regardless, whenever someone starts to share, this is who I am, or this is what feels best for me, that's valid, right? That emergence can occur across the lifespan. I want to break down a few of these developmental stages just to see potentially how gender might come up in childhood versus our preteen years versus those years of adolescence, right? There might be some different things going on at each developmental stage that impacts awareness and ability to be able to communicate. Because again, remember, I need to be able to communicate, to tell someone, this is what feels best, or this is who I am, in order for someone to really know. So when we think about sharing that might occur during childhood, oftentimes our kids are pretty open and comfortable, right? They're discovering their world. They're figuring out what feels good for me. What am I interested in? And so they're oftentimes moving through these spaces, being very open about how they're feeling, what they're seeing, what they're observing. But that sharing, that openness, that ability to feel comfortable to share is heavily dependent on someone's environment. If I'm sharing, I like dresses, I like pink, I like these things, and my environment responds with great, you can like whatever you like, right? Doesn't matter. That environment's also open and comfortable. We're going to get a kiddo that continues to share, this is what I'm interested in. If a child starts to use language to share, this is who I am, right? I'm not a girl, I'm a boy. Or I don't feel like either, I'm just me. If that environment also responds in a way that says, great, thank you for sharing, I love you, I see you, I hear you, you're going to get a kid who continues to share what feels best for their own sense of self, right? But if that environment is correcting or rejecting, our young ones start to close off how often they share. They start to recognize what spaces this is okay to talk about this in, and what spaces it's not okay, right? And so we really think about what type of sharing is happening. When I'm working alongside parents and guardians, I'm often having conversations with parents and caretakers who have kids who are younger, right? Who are starting to communicate for the first time. And I'll do some exploration. What is your child sharing? Is that sharing purely expression? Is your child really just communicating? Again, these are the clothing, these are the toys, these are activities that I'm interested in. Or is your child sharing information about core identity? And usually that identity sharing happens in statements around I am. I am a girl. I am a boy. I'm neither. I'm both. Or when are people going to see that this is who I am? For our young ones, they might ask, why did God make me this way? Why was I born a girl or a boy? Might start having questions about their identity. So trying to figure out what is being shared. Is it purely just expression? Or is there some identity that's also starting to develop, that's also starting to be shared at this age? And I also want to point out that identity sharing is always happening in childhood. People are always sharing, again, this is who I am. Kids, as soon as they can communicate, will start to say what gender feels best for them, right? Think about our young ones. I'm a girl or I'm a boy, right? That identity sharing is always going to happen. But to what degree is a child sharing that actually maybe the doctor got it wrong. Maybe when the doctor told you I was a boy, they were wrong, right? I'm going to share that. And that can happen at a very young age. What we do in our care and support and our guidance for our families is really following affirming models of support. All affirming models of support mean is that I lead with love. I lead with love and care. I continue to tell a child, I see you, I hear you, and I'm here for you. Because we also know that a lot of development is going to happen in this stage. There are a lot of changes. There's a lot of differentiation that's going to start to happen for a young one. And I want to make sure that an environment stays very open. So that way, as a kid continues to develop, as a child starts to think more about who they are, think more about what they like, they can confidently share that if it shifts and if it changes. Affirming models of support really grew out of what we continuously were hearing from the LGBT community. We had so many narratives of LGBTQ elders sharing, I knew this about myself when I was a child. I knew my gender, I knew my sexuality, but I couldn't talk about it. Either I knew it wasn't safe to talk about it, I wasn't going to be supported, or I didn't have the tools to know how to talk about this, right? I didn't know the term transgender. I didn't know the term non-binary. So it wasn't until adulthood, it wasn't until much later in my life that I got to start talking about this. And unfortunately, that process of not being able to share contributes to rises in depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. So in order to prevent those from occurring, we create these spaces where, again, we can have people share what feels best for you, what feels most comfortable. You tell me if that is no longer the case, or you tell me if it's even growing, right? Those affirming models of support really just allow us to hear how someone is developing, what feels best, so that we don't miss anything. We don't contribute to potential isolation or internalization. We also look for psychosomatic signs of distress in childhood. Oftentimes it can be really hard for our kids to use language. Maybe they don't know the terms yet, or maybe they don't know what feels best, or they can't always communicate, hey, I'm really stressed out right now. But I can watch my child's behavior, right? I can look and see, are there things going on that might indicate something stressing this little body out, right? So we oftentimes see kids who all of a sudden have complaints in stomach aches, complaints in headaches or chest pain, right? And there's no medical reason why this should be occurring, right? Or we start to see behavior changes, right? Disruptions in emotional regulation. Things that worked to calm someone down don't work anymore, right? That is all indicative of like something's distressing going on. I want to lean in a little bit. And if I start to weed things out, if I'm really not able to figure out what's happening, I might look at gender, right? Something not feeling good or feeling comfortable, and this little one can't yet share it. I also want to highlight that there's often a misconception that when we affirm, or if we affirm, or if we even talk about gender expression or gender identity, that you're going to make a child transgender. And I want to highlight that there's no way to make someone an identity that is not their own. There's just no way to tell someone, nope, this is your identity, this is who you are. And then that's going to make someone become this different identity. And in fact, when we affirm and we teach about these topics, we're doing a lot of different things. So either A, we're giving our kids the tools to be able to communicate this so they don't have to wait until adulthood to hear the term trans or non-binary for the first time, right? We give them tools to say, hey, if this is how you're feeling, there's a word for that. There's a way to talk about this. And if our kid isn't transgender, if our kid is cisgender, so that means their gender identity aligns with what was assigned at birth, affirming and teaching and talking about gender diversity helps cisgender kids be more aware of their environment, helps them be more aware of that gender diversity. So that way when they have friends or they have loved ones who come out and share, I'm trans, I'm non-binary, right? They can meet that with love and support and acceptance because they're aware that this occurs for people, right? So affirming and teaching and talking about this is actually very positive for lots of different reasons. As we move into our preteen stages of development, maybe gender didn't come up for the first time during childhood, right? So we think about starting to move into those early teenage years. We're not quite there yet. We're getting ready for teenage years. Gender might come up for the first time. We might hear a child talk about gender for the first time because they are figuring out, when does this fit into my environment? When we have families come to our clinic, we ask our youth, tell me why right now feels like the best time to be talking about gender, to be sharing your gender. And our youth will often share back things that are going on in their environment, right? So if they're a part of a public school system or they're on that school calendar, I have a lot of youth who will share that they're waiting until that summer month to finally disclose and finally share, because then they can have that natural transition between school years. So when they start the next school year, they get to start by saying, this is who I am. It's kind of that natural, fresh recycle. We also have youth who talk about what's going on in their family system. You know, my sibling was really sick. We were in and out of the hospital. And now that my sibling's feeling better, I think my parents are in a place where they can hear this. Right? And it's interesting because we'll share that back to parents and they'll say, oh yeah, if our kid came to us 6 months ago, there's no way we would have been able to engage in a conversation just where we were at. So our preteens are very aware of what's happening in their environment. And sometimes they're really thinking about planning this sharing in a way that's going to hopefully allow them to be met with the most support and acceptance. Gender might also come up for the first time because of approaching pubertal development. So we start to have youth who are thinking about puberty, are starting to learn more about what might happen or occur with puberty, or are physically actually going through puberty. Gender might start to come up for the surface because youth are thinking about what's happening with my body. And unfortunately, there might be a rise in distress, right? As youth start to go through puberty, there might be this spike in anxiety and worry about how my body is changing. And if my body is changing in a way that I don't view my body should be changing, oftentimes our youth are thinking about that. Well, why is this happening? Why doesn't this feel good for me? And realizing, oh, there might be a gender component here, right? How I view myself, how I know myself internally is not going to match my anatomy anymore. It's not going to match my external physical appearance. And so puberty can bring gender to the surface. We also have youth at a younger age who have increased access to language and resources. Right? We have more visibility. We have more opportunities for youth to hear about gender diverse people. Right? Remember, I need language in order to communicate how I feel, who I am. And so having that access can allow youth to share at a younger age, right? They don't have to internalize and say, I know there's something going on, but I don't know how to talk about this. Sometimes there's a misconception that comes up in this developmental stage where folks might think that peer pressure contributes to identity emergence. Again, there's no way to make someone an identity that is not their own. And oftentimes I, in fact, talk about peer pressure in the sense where I might hear from a family system, a parent or a guardian share, all of my kids' friends are LGBTQ. And I'm worried that that's making my child think or feel like this is also their identity. And I'll often share back, well, actually, we have more opportunities for kids to hear about gender diverse, sexuality diverse people. Right? So they have that access to language and resources, and they don't have to wait till high school or upon graduating high school to find their community. That all of your kids' friends might be LGBTQ because they are LGBTQ and they got to find their people at a younger age, right? Having that sense of community can be incredibly affirming and incredibly important. What I like to highlight here is really the importance of exploration. That exploration is completely valid and totally normal. All of us explore lots of different parts of ourselves, again, throughout our lifetime. And we think about gender, we think about sexuality, that exploration is very normal. And especially for our younger kids who are able to think about this, who are able to have access to that language, that exploration might just be occurring now at younger ages, simply because there's that awareness and there's that availability to think about it, right? To say, maybe I do fall somewhere in this community. What I like to do for my youth at this age, and this is something we'll talk about too when we think about just creating home environments that are supportive, is to help foster exploration in a really healthy and supportive way. Meaning helping our kids understand that exploring is normal. Sometimes I'll hear from youth that, they're really worried because they haven't found a term that fits best for them, right? All my friends have that label. They can say, I'm trans, I'm non-binary, I'm bisexual, I'm pansexual. Like, they have such confidence in the language they're using. And I'll have youth share back to me, I don't know what term feels best. So you know what? I think I'm just going to pick one so I can have that term. I can have that opportunity to share some language. And with my youth, I just talk about, hey, it's okay to explore. It's okay to question this. And in fact, that Q in LGBTQ, it stands for queer. It also stands for questioning, because the community understands and recognizes that people can think about this, that they can question what it means for them. And in fact, people can question this their entire life. You might never find a term that feels comfortable for you, and that is okay, right? So validate that exploration, validate that questioning to help take some of that potential pressure off of feeling like, I need to know my terms so I can start to share it. It's okay if you don't have a term, right? All that is fine. As we move into adolescence, we think about times where gender might come up for the first time a little bit later in our development. Oftentimes, gender comes up post-puberty. I have a lot of youth who share, puberty was like awkward and weird, but it wasn't incredibly distressing. I'm really actually not distressed by my body, right? Not every trans person experiences dysphoria around their body. So that process of going through puberty might not have brought gender to the surface because it was awkward and clunky, like most experiences with puberty. But my sense of self, my sense of gender isn't really attached to my sex or my body, right? We have even more opportunities for adolescents to have connection to language, connection to resources, growing independence to allow some more freedom and being able to find connection to community. We also know that this is a strong period of identity formation. This is that developmental stage where we are going to spend the most time thinking about our identity, who we are. So it's very natural for kids at this stage to also just be constantly thinking about, who am I? What does feel good? What does feel right for me? And again, that increased independence, especially getting ready to move into that stage of adulthood. A lot of youth who are starting to think about that next chapter and realizing, something hasn't felt always right or always connected for me. And I'm realizing if I look at myself in the future, I don't see myself as the gender everybody sees or thinks that I am, right? So I'm getting ready to have more independence, more freedom. And what do I want that next chapter to look like? When we think about creating gender affirming home environments, so we think about gender can emerge across the lifespan. There's lots of different ways that our children, that our loved ones are going to bring up gender. And so what can we do in our home to help foster and support that? So I want to offer a few resources, and I want to offer as a closing piece of research and information is the impact of creating these affirming environments, right? How beneficial it is on overall well-being when we can affirm. First, as adults, I really want you to explore your own thoughts and feelings about gender. When we start to think about gender, when we think about those messages, we think about our own experiences, a lot actually gets brought up. There is a lot of emotion that gets connected to gender, especially when we start to think about how do I pull apart some of these messages and realizing, oh, I might have had actually a lot of attachment to that message. So it's important to explore maybe where your own thoughts and feelings about gender is. And also, to what degree do I know about gender diversity, right? Might be new to this topic. I might need to maybe learn a little bit more. So that way, once I start to open up a conversation, I can navigate this in a way that feels comfortable. So just figure out where you're starting. A great place to get comfortable is to actually do that gender unicorn activity. Right? Go through that for yourself. Reflect on that. There's a lot of great guiding questions. It's not just for youth to use. Everybody can fill that out. Everybody can have their own experience. I think it's really nice place to start, even for adults, to think about, what do I know? How do I feel about these different elements? And then when we think about having this conversation with our children, really just start a conversation. Use natural moments where statements about gender might come up, right? We might hear our kids say something that contains a gendered message, or maybe we're watching a show together and there's a gender message in there. Ask questions, right? Figure out where our kids understand gender. What's their understanding? How are they internalizing and processing these messages? What are their own feelings, and where have they maybe heard other things, right? That example that we gave where we talked about our own messages, and we think about where else do we hear messages, right? Is this something that our child thought of their own, or is that something maybe their peer said, or they heard on TV, or they watched on the news, right? Where are they getting information so that we can start to insert some opportunities for conversation? But finding those natural moments are great entry points, right? Bring it up really naturally. Again, how do you understand this? What does this mean for you, right? Before we jump into maybe a conversation that our kids aren't even really thinking about. It's always helpful to review resources. I've put together a couple slides for you of different places to start. And Tess will be able to share these slides with everybody, so you'll absolutely have them. And so just looking over those resources. Also, when we start conversations with our kids, it's also okay to say, I don't know. I want to learn more about that, and then let's revisit this conversation. Right? We get to model that we're always learning together. And so when our kids bring something up, if we don't know, we can look at resources together. I can look at them on my own and then come back. But if you pause the conversation, you say, I don't know, let me learn more about it, you got to come back to it. Right? When we think about our own child's process for understanding gender, they're on their own gender journey for reflection, exploration, really just starting from that place of following your kid's lead. Allow room for exploration. Allow space for your kid to think about this. And create that foundation of, no matter where you land or where you end up, or if you stay in this flux space, this home foundation is always going to be strong for you. I'm always going to be here for you. I might not always understand what you're going through, but I want to hear about it. I want to talk to you about this. And really being able to walk alongside your child in this journey is the best way to do it, right? Have that support as a parent, but recognize that your child's on their own journey for this gender support. And then know who your supports are. Especially if your child starts to talk about gender and might fall somewhere under that gender diverse umbrella. I hear from a lot of parents and guardians that it can be hard to know who to reach out to. It can feel potentially isolating. So start to develop your support network, right? We at CHOP can be part of your support network, right? Know where your supports are, who's in that bucket that's going to also affirm your child's experience and your experience as a parent too. You're on this journey as well. Right? Find those support people that you can rely on. Ultimately, though, love truly is the best medicine. Again, when we can use these affirming models of support, when we can communicate to our children, I love you, I see you, I hear you, that is going to give them the best possible outcomes for their overall well-being, physical and mental health. It's going to be so much better when our kids know they have family support. And so in closing, just want to highlight a few areas of research that really show how impactful gender affirmation is. So what does this impact of support look like? So we have historically have research that looks at the impact of non-support, right? When LGBTQ individuals do not receive support, whether it's from their family or from overall different areas of society, we see a decline in physical and mental health. Now we have more researchers who are wanting to look at what happens when we offer support. What are the outcomes when we offer that? So we had a group of researchers who specifically worked with younger age kiddos. So they worked with youth who had not yet gone through puberty, so in that stage of childhood. And what they found was that when kids were supported, when transgender youth received support around their gender identity or their gender expression, that they had developmentally normative levels of depression compared to their cisgender peers, which actually kind of makes a lot of sense if we're already doing this for cisgender kids, right? We're saying, yes, you are a girl, you are a boy. Yes, you can wear or play or do whatever feels comfortable for you. We would hope that when we do this for transgender kids, we'd see the same results. And it's great that we do. What's also really helpful from this research is that it shows that psychopathology is not inevitable within this community. There's often a misconception that being transgender, being gender diverse is a mental health condition, and that's not true. And in fact, transgender people are not depressed because they are transgender. Transgender individuals experience depression because they are navigating a world that does not see them, that does not affirm them, that might actually seek to harm them. Right, so it's that impact from a social environment that contributes to the mental health. And so when we offer that support, we're allowing our kids to develop, again, in that really normative psychological space. We also have a group of researchers who are specifically looking at name and pronoun use. Okay, what happens when we use someone's names and pronouns correctly? And we have lots of researchers who are looking at this information. So we have a group of researchers who did a study in 2017. More recently, we have the Trevor Project that put out a survey to youth and adolescents in 2020 to see what happens when people use your name or your pronouns correctly. And what we find across these research studies is that the more people in a youth's life who use their name and pronouns correctly, the better the mental health outcomes are. Right? When pronouns and names are used correctly, depression decreases, suicidal ideation decreases, and self-harm behavior decreases. So starting with just names and pronouns, it's one of the quickest, easiest ways that we can affirm someone that's going to have a huge impact on their mental health. And so how do we engage and how do we navigate those social areas of support? It's really important that we do so, especially around that mental health. As I mentioned, I put together some resources. So I put together some just general places to start. So some great websites, some great initial books if you're interested in reading or learning more about gender. Also put together some resources based on where your child might be or you might be in terms of wanting to learn more about gender. So great places to go for younger children, for teens, for adults, and for older adults. And then specifically for families, if you have a gender diverse loved one, PFLAG is a really great support network, focuses on sexuality and gender-based support. It's primarily geared towards parents and caregivers. And just a place to go to talk to other people who might be having children with similar experiences. Again, great books to read. And then Gender Spectrum is a really great one if you have younger aged kiddos and you're wanting a little bit more one-on-one support. And then the contact information for our program. If you're looking for resources, if you think it could be helpful or beneficial to bring your child or to even just have an initial conversation with us, please feel free to reach out. We are happy to help support in any way that would feel comfortable. I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share, and just the rest of the time, again, if there are questions, points of clarity, observations, any discussion that we can have around this topic, I'm more than happy to create space for.
Thank you for sharing those resources and those papers. Those are really helpful. I feel like that's like one of the things when I talk to other people, they're always like wondering where I get that information from, you know.
Yes. Yeah.
So thank you. I appreciate that.
Oh.
Sam, I had a question. Thank you for sharing everything. Do you have any words of wisdom for the extended family and sort of how to navigate through that with grandparents who are just maybe not being very supportive?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Great question. So a couple different things. One, I find that resources and education for extended families also really helpful. PFLAG is kind of the first place to start. They have like different subsections. Navigating conversations is also really important to think about within my family. What are our boundaries? I do a lot of conversations with immediate family about what boundary do we want to put around our child, right? And so if that boundary is, when we're having family time together, I need everybody to be using the right name and pronouns. And if that can't be honored in that space, then we might sit out from this family session, right? That might be a boundary that a family needs to put. What can be really helpful is how to communicate those boundaries to families. So actually on Gender Spectrum's website, they have a whole communicating with extended family and also friends and chosen family like resources. So they have different letter templates if a family's interested in kind of like communicating through written word, how to have conversations, but really trying to figure out what does feel the most comfortable for your own family system. I have lots of parents who are like, oh, I'll totally engage in conversation, ask me all the questions, happy to entertain that. I have other parents who are like, I'm trying to figure it out and that I just can't right now entertain like lots of questions or having conversations. So like, okay, if that's your boundary right now, have your resources to give to your parents, right? Of, hey, we're figuring this out as a family. I want you to go read some stuff. And then maybe we can talk about this in like a month, right? Like figure out what boundary feels the most comfortable. Gender Spectrum also offers a national support group to grandparents. So potentially being able to connect with other grandparents who are navigating support for their family member. I've heard really beautiful things about that network and that support too. So also just recognizing that extended family is going to be on their own journey too. And so what do they need to feel more supported and more aware? I'm a resource giver by nature, so I'm always to be like, hey, here's some stuff to read or here's some places to go. But I think as an immediate family, figure out what type of conversation or what type of boundary you want to put, and then to what degree do you want to communicate that, and then offer resources to those extended family members.
I'm curious, Sam, what experience you have with parents who are coming to terms with their young person identifying with a different name or gender or pronouns. How do you observe grief in that process for parents or relatives?
Yeah, I think it's really important to honor where anybody's at in this journey. Again, it's a journey for the individual who's navigating their own identity, and their loved ones are going to be on this journey with them. And so when I'm doing parent or caregiver one-on-one sessions, kind of just honor where they're starting from. And what I often find is this balance of being aware of like, I'm going through my own emotional process and I want to be there to support my child. So how do I separate and differentiate that and make sure that my child's not like absorbing this kind of like emotional process that I'm having? Therapy can be really, really helpful for that, just to have, their own space to navigate. Because again, a lot of things come up in that process. And I've had a lot of parents share, I didn't think I was going to be triggered by my child getting rid of all of the clothes in their closet. Like I didn't think that was going to be a thing. And then I'm watching my child throw out all of these dresses that I've bought over the years, or these things that I realized I attached emotional value to, and I'm having this reaction. And so how to help just create space to honor that emotion and then move through that. And so being able to have, if a therapeutic resource would feel helpful, having a therapist on hand to just help process. I find that support groups are really, really beneficial to parents and guardians, just having other people to talk to who've probably been through a very similar experience, can offer their own, hey, this is what worked for us, this is how we did it, and also to just validate it. I think sometimes there's some guilt that gets attached to grief, that sometimes parents are like, I shouldn't be feeling this way, and I feel bad for feeling this way. And so just have people who can validate that, of like, you're going to have your own emotional process too. And again, how do we have that while simultaneously making sure that our child feels loved and supported? But I do think that there's space to honor and recognize where someone's in that journey, and then what do they need to feel is going to help move them through that process.
I'll go again. What do you say to a parent who says, well, isn't this just a phase?
So I switch the language on that. So instead of phase, I like to say period of exploration. That yes, this could be a period of exploration. And what we know is that periods of exploration are incredibly normal and incredibly valid. And what's really important is that if our child is exploring anything, being able to support them through that exploration, being able to support, again, is this expression, is this also identity? Because if at the end of the day, the outcome of this period of exploration is, yeah, actually, like, I realize I am cisgender, I just tend to like my expression in different ways, or, I explored that, realized it really wasn't true to my core identity or my core sense of self. What a youth gets out of that when their parents supported and met them in that process is that, wow, I could talk to my parents about this, and they watched me go through this, and they offered that affirmation and that support, right? So the outcome is that we probably will have even more communication if there is an additional period of exploration. If other things come up, our kids are not going to feel as worried about going to their parents, because they were able to reflect and say, wow, even when I was going through talking about gender, my parents were open to that. Even if they didn't understand or they didn't really fully know, this was a time where I could talk about and I could share, and it was still met with love. So yeah, I think, again, normalizing those explorations, and then how do we just create really healthy, supportive boundaries around that? It's not a free-for-all. It's not just like, hey, like run wild. You're still parents, and you still put safety restrictions and safety boundaries around your child and that process, but still being able to honor, they're figuring out who they are, and a part of that might be exploring gender, and it might be exploring expression. And how do we just make sure they feel comfortable through that process, and then realizing at the end of the day, if this isn't ultimately what feels comfortable, that's okay too. Yeah.
All right. Unless there's any other questions, seems like there's not. Thank you so much, Sam, for all of this. This was extremely informative, and I can tell you've done this a lot before, because it was just very orderly, and I feel very good about putting this on our resources website, also known as our YouTube page, for other families to see and other young people. So thank you so much. I'll be sending out the video and the slideshow and these resources in an email this week to our families.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Tess. I appreciate it. And thank you all for joining and being open to the conversation.
Thank you, Sam.